Welcome back to the program. It's Wake Up Call from the Pro Siding and Windows Studios. I'm Mike Hendren, and we've got a very special guest in the studio with us. Ronny Jackson is with us. He is running for the Republican nomination for 13th Congressional District. Good morning.
Morning, Mike. Thank you for having me.
May I call you Ronny?
You absolutely may.
All right. Well, Ronny, welcome to the show, and welcome to Wichita Falls. And so we're going to just jump right into it. This is a huge race. The 13th Congressional District is seen as a very, very important district because of its size,
right?
The role it plays, of course, with the military, with Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls. And this is a seat that hasn't really been available to anyone in 26 years. Mac Thornberry has been our congressman since the mid-90s, and he's had opponents, but no one's really been able to make a dent in his candidacy in this office. Now he has decided to retire from the 13th Congressional District, and this seat is wide open. I believe at last count there were 15 Republicans running for this.
Pretty crowded.
It's a pretty crowded field. Of course, there won't be that many in a few weeks. This will start to thin out a little bit. But the primary is coming up in March, and you recently decided to put your hat in the ring. And so I want to start here by letting you introduce yourself to people who may not be familiar with who you are. You were the official White House physician for how long?
For 14 years.
So I'm going to let you talk a little bit about you and introduce yourself to the audience, who you are, how you got into the medical field, your military service. Let's just talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, so, I was born and raised in this region of Texas, at the southern edge of what most people would refer to as North Texas. I grew up in Levelland. It's a lot like the small towns up in this district. We used to come up here and play football all the time when I was growing up. Borger, Canyon, Pampa, places like that. I used to go hunting up here, prairie chicken, quail, pheasant, things of that nature. Yeah. So familiar with the area. I ended up going to college when I got out of high school and didn't really plan to go to college, to be honest with you. I'm the first person in my family that's ever gone to college, ever got a college education in my family. And I ended up going to South Plains College when I got out of high school, mainly because most of my friends were going off to college and I was kind of the only one that wasn't. And I still remember having a conversation with my dad at one point, and we're, after I got into college, and he started asking me like, hey, when are you going to give up this college stuff and get a job, And and I think he kind of maintained that attitude all the way up until maybe the day I graduated from medical school. And then he might have thought, well, maybe this college thing wasn't such a bad idea after all. But I ended up going to South Plains College for a couple of years, got my associate's degree there. And while I was there, I'd kind of got into scuba diving, which sounds a little odd coming from that part of Texas. There's no water or trees or anything out there. But whenever I finished at South Plains College, I had decided that I wanted to actually be a marine biology major. And so I wanted to go to Texas A&M and be a marine biology major, which is what I did. So I went to Texas A&M at Galveston. I was a marine biology major there. Part of my decision-making through all of this process was also financial. I come from a hardworking blue-collar family. My dad's an electrician. My mother stayed home and raised us. And we didn't have a lot of disposable income. We certainly didn't have enough income for my folks to send me to college. So I pretty much have worked full-time since age of 14. I was a sacker and a stocker at the United supermarket there. Did that for a long, long time. And I worked, anywhere from 32 to 60 hours a week while I was going to high school, my entire high school career, sacking groceries, stocking and checking and that nature. Paid for my own vehicles, my own clothes, all that kind of stuff when I was in high school, even junior high. So whenever I got ready to, and that paid for my tuition at South Plains College. To be honest with you, that's part of the reason I ended up going there. It was $8 a semester hour. It was a bargain back then. So you couldn't beat it. But when I decided I was going to go off to A&M, I needed to have a little bit more money to pay for my tuition. So I started working as a roustabout in the oil field. Well, I went off to Texas A&M at Galveston, and I was doing real well there. I was in the Corps Cadets there my first year there, and I was doing okay. I was working as a resident advisor there, and I had a job in one of the labs, but I didn't quite have enough money to go out and have much of a social life. So I went over to the University of Texas Medical Branch, the UT Medical School. It's the main medical school for University of Texas. It's there in Galveston as well. And I talked to those folks, and I said, hey, look, I need to, I'm looking for a job. I was wondering if, they said, well, we have these jobs that are for the medical students, these work-study jobs, but the med students aren't really taking advantage of them. Well, they gave me a job in the pathology department as an autopsy assistant. And I had never, ever in my entire life, not one time ever considered going to medical school. It just never crossed my mind. I never saw myself as a doctor ever. And so I got in there and I said, okay, well, I'll do that. So my job was basically to take the organs out of the body and pass them down to the end of the table to the pathologist, and they would dissect everything out and you'd figure out why the person died. So I'd take all the organs out, take the brain out, all that kind of stuff, pass it down into the table. And these guys started teaching me. They said, hey, do you remember that liver you took out last week? And I said, yeah. You remember what it looked like? I said, yeah. They said, well, come look at this one. This guy died from liver cancer. See this? And so I got interested in medicine. They started, kind of teaching me, and I started getting interested in it. So I decided I wanted to be a doctor, and I'd grown up, working with EMS. I was a volunteer firefighter when, from the time I was 17, which I think the youngest age you could do it, all the way up until I was 21 years old. I was a volunteer firefighter, and I'd worked with paramedics and firefighters and things of that nature. So I pretty quickly decided that, I'd fit best if I was an emergency medicine physician, ER doc. Mm-hmm. So that's what I wanted to do, be an ER doc. I was confronted once again with the same problem I'd had before. Is like, well, I want to go to med school now, but how am I going to possibly pay for med school? I thought, well, what, I was in the Corps at A&M. I'm going to call the military and see if they have a military medical school. Maybe I can go there, and maybe that'll solve my problem. So I called the recruiter, and the recruiter said, nope, we don't have a military medical school. They actually do, but he didn't know about it, or didn't want to tell me about it, one or the other. But he said, we got this program. It's called the Health Professions Scholarship Program. If you get into med school somewhere in the United States, we'll pay for it, but you got to get in first. Mm-hmm. I said, all right. So I went ahead and I applied for medical school, applied for only in-state schools, because I figured if that didn't work, there's no way I could afford to go out of state. So I just applied to in-state schools. I got into all the schools in the state, I think, that I applied to. I got in Tech and UTMB and A&M and all those. But I wanted to go at UTMB, at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, because that's where I was living. That's where all my friends were at the time, and it was kind of a young medical school population. Everybody was single there. I was single at the time. I got in there, and then I remember that conversation. I called the detailer back, and he goes, yep, we'll let you apply for the scholarship. Applied for the scholarship, and I got it. The Navy paid for my 4 years of med school, and it was year for year. They paid for 4 years, and I owed them 4 years payback. So I figured I'd do my 4 years, and and I'd get out and then go, be an emergency medicine doc somewhere, make a ton of money, and whatever, Right. And that was my plan. But actually, when I got in, I was just I just enjoyed it way too much. I really, really enjoyed my time in the military, or in particular, my early years in the military. So the way this started was, as soon as I got in, I found out about this program called the Diving Medical Officer Program, where you could be a diver. And remember, I told you I like to scuba dive a lot, and I was big into that. You could be a diver and a doctor. And I was like, wow, this is like tailor-made for me, right? So I applied for that, and I got into that program. So they sent me to Panama City, Florida, and sent me completely through Navy Deep Sea Diving School. And I did that 6 months, and I became a full-fledged Navy Deep Sea diver. And so when I got out, I was a diver and I was a physician. I was a doctor, right? So for the next 5 years, they assigned me specifically to diving units as the physician, to diving units, to support those units and dive with them and support their diving. Yeah. So I was with explosive ordnance disposal teams. I was with underwater demolition type teams, underwater salvage teams, with SEAL teams, things of that nature. That's all I did for the next 5 years. And I was having a blast, man. I mean, I was going out and I was, jumping out of airplanes. I was fast roping out of helicopters. I was locking out of submarines with the SEAL team. Yeah. I was blowing stuff up and shooting all kinds of weapons. It was like, being paid to be a kid. It was awesome. Yeah. And so I did that. But at some point I realized, like, hey, if I want to get promoted and continue to move up in the Navy, I got to get board certified in something. I got to go out. At the time I was like just kind of a general practice doctor and a diving and a diver, but I needed to be an emergency medicine doc and do that as a career. So I went back and I went to the Naval Hospital at Portsmouth, Virginia, and I got into the emergency medicine residency program there, did 3 years there, became a Navy emergency medicine doc. At the time, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were both pretty hot. This is in 2004 when I graduated from residency. If you were a board certified Navy emergency medicine physician at that time, by default, you belonged to the Marine Corps, because that's what they needed is all. So as soon as I graduated and got board certified, they shipped me off to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I joined the 2nd Marines there, and I immediately deployed to Iraq with the 2nd Marines to a place called Daqatam. Daqatam was kind of between Fallujah and Ramadi. It was a pretty violently contested place back then, a pretty nasty place in Iraq. And the Marines were just, they were getting, butchered when they would go in there. They would go into Ramadi to do missions. They would come out and, RPGs and IEDs and all kinds of stuff, and they were just getting butchered. And so I did that for a year. I was the OIC of that shock trauma platoon. I was actually the OIC of the resuscitation component of that shock trauma platoon. And, we had bad injuries. We had guys coming in. We had on average maybe 3 to 4 a day. Some days we wouldn't get any injuries, but some days we'd get 15 all at once. Wow. And these were guys were coming in with their arms and legs blown off, with their bowels hanging out, just horrible total body surface area burns. I mean, bad stuff. While I was there, I got nominated for a job at the White House, which I didn't even know existed. I got an email on an account that I hadn't been checking anymore, because I had an account with the Marines. I had an account with the hospital that I'd come from. And it was really difficult to check your email out there. You had to stand in line for a long time, and then it just took forever to get on. And so it was a real pain to check your email. So what I did is I stopped kind of checking that other email. I was just checking my primary email account. And I'd check that other one about every 7 to 10 days, just kind of keep up with the gossip at the White House. Well, I got on one day, and it had been probably 7 to 10 days since I checked it, and there was an email in there from my detailer, the guy that decides where you're going to go do, where your active duty assignments are going to be.
Right.
And he said, hey, you've been nominated for a job at the White House. Please have your personal statement, your CV, your security information, your last 6 fitness reports, your official photo, just a list of things 9 miles long they wanted, and they wanted it like in 5 days. So I thought, well, there's no way I can do that, and so I wasn't even going to do it. I talked to my wife on the phone that night, and she was like, look, Ronnie, she said, why don't you go ahead and just like do your best to get it all in, so at least you can say you were considered. That might mean something someday. You know, it might be important that you were considered. And, you know, she was right, like she usually is. So I went ahead and I followed her advice, and I got all that, and I got it all in by the deadline. And I just figured I didn't have much of a chance. I figured everybody else would have some really nice squared away packages, and I'd have just a big pile of garbage, you know, because she was digging stuff out of the filing cabinet, trying to fax it to him. I was ginning stuff up electronically out there, and I'm in the middle of the desert trying to do this. I got it all in by the deadline. Then I didn't hear anything for like 2.5 months, not a word. So I kind of stopped checking that email account again, and sure enough, about 2.5 months, I checked it again. It had been 7 to 10 days since I checked it again. And there was an email in there from my detailer, and it said, hey, you've been selected as one of 3 people to interview for the job at the White House. Please be in D.C. like in 5 days. I was like, whoa. I was like, well, I can't believe I made it this far, but this is where the road ends, right? I'm not going to be in D.C. in 5 days. I kind of didn't think I had any way of making that happen. And so it just so happens, you know, a lot of what happens to you in life is being in the right place at the right time and having people around you that want to support you and see you do well, you know. And, you know, you can't really control that, but if those people are out there, they can really impact your life. And that's kind of what happened to me. It turns out that the commanding general for all of the Al-Anbar province, which was all the Marines in Iraq at the time, used to be the military aide for Bush 41, for the elder Bush, right? And that's a guy that carries the nuclear football, you know, and all that. And that guy and the doctor and the Secret Service agent are a team that are with the president 24/7, 365. So that guy knew exactly what I was being asked to do. I didn't really know, but he knew exactly what they were asking me to do. He understood the job. So anyways, he summoned me at his office, and I didn't really know him very well. You know, I had seen him come through our tent a few times when we were getting casualties and stuff, and, you know, but I didn't know him. But I told my commanding officer, who told his commanding officer, who told the general, and the general summoned me to his office. He said, well, tell me what's going on. So I told him the story, and he goes, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, sir, there's no way I'm going to be in D.C. in 5 days, but I'm going to see if I can do a video teleconference or maybe do an interview over the phone. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to give it a shot. And he said, well, hang on one second. And so he picked up the phone. He was making a call, and he called the air boss, the guy that controls all the air assets in the entire area. And he was talking to him, and then he just, you know, the last thing he said was, I'll paraphrase it. He said something like, you know, I want his butt out of here today, right? Yeah. And then he told me, he goes, go pack, you're leaving. And I said, yes, sir. So I went back to my hooch where all my stuff was, and I packed a bag. I threw some stuff in my sea bag, and I got on a helicopter and flew to Baghdad. And then when I got to Baghdad, I got on a C-5 cargo plane full of broken helicopters, flew me back to Cherry Point, North Carolina. Then when I got to Cherry Point, North Carolina, I got a rental car, and I drove to Virginia Beach, where I was living at the time. Well, I'd been working out, like running in the mornings, running in the evenings, twice a day. I was out running like 6 miles at a time. I'd lost 40 pounds while I was out there, so none of my clothes fit. I was supposed to interview 2 days in a business suit, and 1 day in a uniform. Well, I didn't have anything that fit, a uniform or a suit. So I ran down immediately after getting to Virginia Beach, I ran down to the men's warehouse, and I bought a new suit. And then I just begged them basically to tailor it for me on the spot there and help me get it done. So they did. Then I brought my uniform in and kind of begged them to help me make that presentable, which they did. Then I got in my car and I drove to D.C. I interviewed for three days in D.C. for the job. At the end of the 3 days, they told me I got the job. So then so I got back on the plane, went back to Iraq, finished my tour for 4 months in Iraq. And then when I was done with my tour in Iraq, I went straight from Iraq to the White House. That was 14 years ago in the George Bush administration. I've been there ever since.
That is an incredible story. And that brings us up to what's happening right now, and that is the congressional run. And there's a little more in between, and we're going to get into that. We'll take a break here. When we come back, we'll continue with Ronny Jackson. He is one of the candidates for the 13th Congressional District Republican nomination. The primary's coming up March the 3rd. It's a whole lot closer than we think. We're back with more Wake Up Call right after this. Welcome back. Wake Up Call from the Pro Siding and Windows Studios. I'm Mike Hendren, and my guest is Ronny Jackson, one of the candidates for the Republican nomination for 13th Congressional District here in North Texas. So you retired from the military. You made the decision to run for 13th Congressional District. There were some controversies that popped up recently within the last year or so, year and a half. I think it was spring of 18,
That's
actually.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You were nominated by President Trump to serve as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there were some accusations leveled against you about drinking on the job, about dispensing prescription medications to random people in the White House. Address those controversies, if you would. Well,
I'll start by telling you that 100% false. I mean, no truth to those accusations whatsoever. And I'll just explain it to you. So, kind of the way this all happened, Mike, was, to be honest with you, it was kind of my first time to dabble in politics. And my job at the White House was not political in any shape, form, or fashion. I was the doctor, and my job was clinical. My job was to take care of the president, the first family. Whenever the secretary of the nominee came up, obviously that's a political position. But it's the veterans, right? So, everyone on both sides of the aisle should be on board with taking care of the veterans, right? So I didn't think that it was going to be like being the Secretary of State or, the Secretary of Defense or something like that, where those jobs can get pretty political. I thought, well, we're all on the same page here with the vets. We all want to take care of our vets, right? And, me being active duty and, my son being active duty and, me about to become a veteran and get out at some point in the near future. I have a big interest in that. So anyways, things turned, to be honest with you, the point where my whole life kind of took a turn with regards to all this, and actually ultimately, which I'm happy with, led me to where I'm at right now, sitting here with you talking about the 13th Congressional District, is, and some people remember this, is the day that I briefed the president's physical exam. And that was kind of a landmark day because a lot of the press, a lot of the liberals, a lot of the Democrats, I think they thought they had the president over a barrel to some extent when this was happening. They had been talking for weeks before that about like he's physically unfit to be president, he's cognitively unfit, and they were going over all these, making all these accusations about his fitness to be president, on mental and physical basis, right? And I did his physical, and I presented his physical exactly the way it was, just objective data that I put out there. And what I did is I did some cognitive testing on the president too that no one had expected me to do, and I did it because some of the stuff that people were saying leading up to the physical, and I talked to the president about it, and the president was like, "Sure, man, let's do it. I want to do it." So we did, but no one knew I did that. And so I think when that press brief happened, I think the initial effort was going to be to kind of tear the president down on that level, and I think that a lot of people thought that was going to be a day that that was going to be a turning point in his fitness to be president. And I went in there and I briefed his physical exactly like it happened, and I gave all the objective data, and I took all that off the table, because the president was completely physically and mentally fit to be president. And I had the objective data to prove that, and I talked about it. Well, when that happened, I became public enemy number one for a lot of folks in D.C., a lot of the really liberal press and a lot of the people on the left. And to be honest with you, some never Trump Republicans as well. And I was a marked man from that point forward. Well, I've been with President Bush since day one of his administration. I was with him on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2017. Been with him ever since. He and I've got to know each other really well. I see him every morning. My office was right below his bedroom. He'd drop down in the morning in the elevator. I'd be the first person he'd see in the mornings, last person he'd see in the evenings when he'd go back up to work. I'd walk him over to the Oval Office in the mornings a lot of times and talk with him. We got to know each other real well. And, we got along well, and which ultimately resulted in we talked about all kinds of stuff, including we talked about the vets all the time. We talked about the veterans, and he asked me. So it didn't just come out of nowhere. I'd been talking to him about these issues with the veterans for a long, long time before he nominated me for that position. But when it came time, he wanted to replace Secretary Shulkin as the Secretary of the VA. He wanted to make me the secretary, and I didn't know that was coming either. And we were coming back, from Mar-a-Lago on Air Force One. And, we'd been talking about the veterans out at Mar-a-Lago, and we'd been talking about the veterans at the White House before that. And, and I didn't know, that Secretary Shulkin was going to be leaving, in the next few days. But we'd been talking about a lot of stuff about the vets. And he called me up to the cabin. My medical cabin is right behind his office. And he walked past my office, or past my medical cabin on his way up to his office. And he said, "Hey, come on up to the office. I want to talk." I said, "All right." So I went up to the office on Air Force One, and I sit down in his office up there, and he said, "Hey, I want to make a proposal. I want you to do something for me." And I said, "Yes, sir. What do you need?" And he goes, "I want you to be a member of my cabinet. I want you to be my VA secretary." And I said, "What?" He said, "You can do it, right?" And I said, "Yes, sir. I can absolutely do it." And he said, "Well," he goes, "Do you want to do it?" And I said, "Well," I do want to do it. I said, what brought this on? And he goes, "Well, I just been thinking about it. You're the right person for the job. I mean, you're a veteran, you're a Navy admiral, you understand the vets, you know the issues." He said, "You would advocate for the vets, and you wouldn't let a lot of this politics get in the way of what we need to do for our veterans."
Yeah.
And so I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, why don't you do this?" He goes, "I want you to go home, talk to your wife about it." And then he goes, "Tomorrow, let's get together and let's find out if we're going to do this or not. Because, your whole family needs to be behind this, obviously." And I said, "Yes, sir." So I went home, talked to my wife, and my whole family was pretty supportive of it. And so we did. We pulled the trigger on it. And the next day, he announced that Secretary Shulkin was going to be leaving. That Wilkie would be the acting secretary, and that I was going to be the nominee. And so from that point forward, that day I resigned as his physician, as his personal physician, because I was like, there's no way I can go through the nomination process, which is a full-time job, just going through that process and still like do a good job taking care of everybody's medical needs as the doctor. So the day that he nominated me, I resigned in writing as his personal physician, and I became the nominee for Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And that was a full-time job for sure. I was in the mornings from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock at night. I was getting briefs just back to back all day long. They were doing murder boards at night where they were prepping me for my Senate hearings and things of that nature. It was busy. I was meeting with senators on the Hill just left and right. I met with, I think, 28 of them before it was all over with, one-on-one. Wow. And so that took a lot of time as well. And anyways, so I did that for about 2 months, and then during this 2-month period, these accusations came out of nowhere, right? Yeah. And it was right before the hearing. My hearing was scheduled literally for the next week, within less than 7 days, and suddenly these accusations came out. And I'll tell you exactly what happened. I mean, there were a few disgruntled employees that I've had over the years, because I ran the White House medical unit most of my time at the White House. I was in charge, and I had a large unit. I had up to 60 people, doctors, nurses, physicians, medics, corpsmen, some civilians, administrators that all worked for me, so I had a staff. And just like everything else, if you're running a business and you're running it right, there's going to be a few people who aren't, making the cut. Right. And you're going to have to, tell them, hey, it's time for you to move on and do something else. And so that probably happened a couple of times, but for the most part, what happened is people wanted to stay. Everyone wants to stay when they get to the White House. They want to extend. They want to, hey, can you call the Navy, call the Air Force, call the Army, whatever, and put an extension in so I can stay a couple more years. And we try to do that. If we got people that are really making a difference, that are, that are carrying their weight, plus some, we want to keep those people around because they're on occasion, there are a few people that are just, just getting by and, and we can't extend everybody. So we make choices about who we're going to extend based on their performance. Sure. So there were a few people that wanted to extend that didn't get extended that I think were a little disgruntled when they left. And what happened is those people, whenever it became public that I was the nominee, they had worked with some other folks that had been part of the last administration, and they got access to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee on the Democrat side, and they made these accusations. And these accusations are completely false. I mean, they made an accusation regarding, narcotics, opioids and stuff, and this accusation that I was called the Candyman. That's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've never, ever heard anyone call me that. I was talking to Dan Bongino yesterday on the phone, and Dan was making a point. He's like, Ronnie, I worked with you for years and years in the White House. I never, ever heard that term. He said, when I first heard that, I thought that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And, and to be honest with you, the Secret Service looked into that. They investigated that and some other stuff that were out there, and everything was found to be completely unsubstantiated and no evidence of any of that, and it was closed out by them, but by the White House as well. Well, and like I said, there was this accusation about narcotics. I can tell you right now, Mike, I can count the number of times that I have prescribed or given narcotics to a patient during my last 14 years at the White House on one hand. I never, ever, ever gave narcotics to anybody for any reason. I just didn't have a reason to. If I was in the emergency department, I was treating people with broken bones and horrible injuries and stuff like that. Yeah, I would, I'd give narcotics out sometimes because that's what we do. But in my job at the White House, I didn't have that kind of patient population. I didn't use narcotics there for anything. Right. I mean, and we didn't carry them in our bags most of the time. We had access to them on the plane, this, that, or the other if we needed them. But it was not something we did. So that's a complete farce. And then there was also an accusation that I had got drunk at a Secret Service party and wrecked a government vehicle. I have no idea where that story came from. That's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. I've never, ever been in an accident involving alcohol my entire life, right? And I have never even been to a Secret Service Christmas party my entire life. So that just came out of nowhere, you know. And it was actually, if you look back, there was a Secret Service agent that got accused of that about a year and a half before this accusation came out of me. Yeah. And it looked like to me someone took that news story from the Washington Post or wherever it was and just cut that name out and put my name in it. It was crazy. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. So these accusations, there was absolutely no merit to them, and evidenced by the fact that if there was any merit to these accusations, I wouldn't have stayed at the White House, right? I wouldn't have stayed I got promoted. After I withdrew my nomination as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the president promoted me to an assistant to the president, which is, kind of the highest level in the West Wing that you can have. So, so I was one of probably like 15, 16 assistants to the president at the time. So the president actually promoted me to the assistant of the president. The president nominated me for my second star, right? I maintained my top secret security clearance the entire time. I stayed at the White House, and I stayed as a flag officer, as a Navy admiral. So if there were any truth to any of those accusations, none of those things would have happened. I would not have been able to do any of that. And so, it just went on, and it just never closed. The investigation went nowhere, zero. And they were just hanging it over my head because they knew that there were folks that were involved in the investigation that literally hate the president and hate what he represents in the administration. And I was basically, had the Trump stamp on me. And to some extent, I don't regret it, and I don't regret it at all. But, I was being punished because of my association with the president, to be honest with you. That's what was happening. And they knew as long as they kept this investigation open, I couldn't get out of the Navy, right? Because I couldn't retire with an open investigation, and I couldn't get my second star because you can't get promoted with an open investigation.
Right.
So I was in limbo, and they took some comfort in the fact that they were doing this. So anyways, after almost 2 years went by, I said, you know what, enough of this. I'm out. I'm getting out. And, I enjoyed my job. I was having a great time. I was working on policy at the time. As assistant to the president, I changed from being his clinical doctor to doing policy. Right. So I was assistant to the president and chief medical advisor, and I was working on policy issues, border issues, I was working on Indian health stuff. I was working on stuff at the VA with pharmaceutical pricing, all these different policy issues, and I enjoyed it. But I'd been in 25 years now. It was time to move on, and I'll get into some more detail about what led me to pulling the trigger when I did.
We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll continue with Ronny Jackson, one of the Republican candidates for 13th Congressional District, and we will talk more with him after this here on Wake Up Call. Welcome back to Wake Up Call. Mike Hendren here with you. My guest is Ronny Jackson, one of the Republican candidates for 13th Congressional District. You mentioned Twitter a moment ago, and you mentioned we were talking a little bit about your Twitter account during a break, and the social media now plays a huge role in politics. It has really since the Obama administration. That's where we really started seeing a major role for social media in the political game. And you've learned, as well as anybody, how explosive that can be. So your Twitter account, a few days ago, you had how many followers?
750, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Then something happened, and all of a sudden, the floodgates opened. You now have how many Twitter followers this morning?
I think now I have 22,000 this morning. Yeah.
How did that happen?
So what happened is, I should start by telling you that I don't know anything about social media. It's all new to me, because being a active duty military officer and being at the White House with my clearance and everything, they really discourage that, right? You don't want to be on social media. So I've never had a Twitter account, never had a Facebook account, any of that until I became a candidate. But I was in the car the other day, and I was talking to Dan Bongino, who's a good friend of mine, right? Dan worked together when Dan was in the Secret Service, and I've known Dan for a long time, and love Dan, respect Dan, great American, and great friend. He was talking to me, and he said, well, you got your Twitter stuff set up, right? And I go, yeah. And he goes, well, what's your Twitter address? And so he was looking it up while he's talking to me on the phone. He said, Ronny, you got to, he started schooling me a little bit on it. You got to do this, you got to do that. And he was trying to give me a little bit of advice. And he goes, well, I'm going to shoot out an email right now to my followers and get some people fired up. Right at that particular moment, I had 751 Twitter followers. He did that within 5 minutes. I had an additional 2,000. Another hour later, I had another 10,000. And I mean, literally within 10 hours, probably before I went to bed that night, I went from 751 to 22,000. Power of social media, you can't underestimate it, right?
It's frightening how powerful it is, and it's frightening how fast it can grow.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about running in the 13th Congressional District. Of course, you're from Levelland. You're from which district again?
That's the 19th Congressional District. That's Jody Arrington. Yeah.
So a lot of people are probably going to ask the question, why not run there? Why move into the 13th and run here?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's pretty simple. I mean, I always thought about getting into politics while I was in the military, but when you're in the military, obviously it's not an option. And at some point, you're in the military long enough that you realize it's going to be a career for you, like it was for me. I was in 25 years, right? So, it's kind of something in the back of your mind that you'd like to do someday, but you got to finish your career first in the military, which I did. I was getting close to getting out. I've been in 25 years now. I'm already a Navy Rear Admiral. I thought about getting out. I was figuring out what I was going to do, and I was still kind of toying with the politics, but I didn't know where that was going to happen or when that was going to happen. I knew I was coming back to Texas. That's one thing I did know, because there's no way. I was born and raised in Texas. Right. I started my military career as a resident of Texas, and I maintained my Texas residency in the entire time I was in the military. And there was no way, not even for one day, that I was going to become a resident of any other state besides Texas. So I was planning to come down probably on house hunting leave a couple of months before I got off of active duty and buy a place in Texas to establish my residency in Texas, so I could go straight from active duty to Texas without a gap. To be honest with you, I was thinking a little bit. My folks have a place at Possum Kingdom, and I was thinking about looking at a place down there, this, that, and the other, and that's in the 19th Congressional District as well. I was thinking about that. A lot of Texas representatives, a lot of the guys in the House in Texas right now, had said they weren't going to run again. So there was this kind of, the media labeled as the Texodus or something. There were a lot of members of Congress from Texas pulling chalks, and they weren't going to run again, right? And I thought about, would I run in one of those districts? And the answer to that was a pretty resounding, and it was no. And the reason I say that is because I'm not from those districts, right? And I don't feel like I identify with people from those districts. I can be honest with you, I'm super conservative, and I cannot run in a district that's on the precipice of becoming blue that bleeds into somewhere like Austin, Texas. I can't. Right. I don't identify with those people. I don't agree with those people on most issues. Whenever Congressman Thornberry announced that he wasn't running again, and he did that a little bit later than everybody else, it was kind of after the fact, that's when everything came together for me. And I said, you know what? That is the area of Texas I grew up in. Those are the people that I consider my people, that I understand, that I think I can represent, that I think understand me, and I share their values across the board, whether it's their physical conservative, socially conservative, their issues on pro-life and Second Amendment and borders and everything else. I have everything in common with the people in North Texas, with the Panhandle in North Texas. And you're asking why I didn't run in 19? Well, 19's got Jody Arrington right now, and Jody's a fantastic representative, right? And Jody's running in that district, and I would have been happy running in 19 as well. That's where I grew up. 19 and 13 are very, very similar, and the people in 19 and 13 are very similar, and especially the people in Levelland are very similar to the people up in the Panhandle and the people in North Texas. So I think that I'm a great fit for 13, and I would have been living in 13 a long time ago if I hadn't been in the military. But for 25 years now, I haven't had a say-so in where I live. Right. I left the great state of Texas 25 years ago when I raised my hand and joined the Navy, and I went to Virginia where the Navy assigned me. And in the last 25 years, I've not had the ability to have a voice at all in where I live. This is my very first opportunity in the last 25 years to decide where I'm going to live, and I decided that I'm moving back to the Amarillo area, and I want to represent the 13th Congressional District because I understand those people and they understand me.
So term limits. Now, Mac Thornberry has stated repeatedly through his congressional career that he supports term limits. Right. And when he ran back in the early 90s, one of the promises was that he was not going to make a lifetime career out of being a congressman, that he was going to, I think 12 years was a number he threw out at one point, which would be 6 terms in Congress. Where do you stand on term limits? And do you plan to set a mark for yourself and say, okay, I'm going to serve this many terms, and then I'm getting out. I'm going back to private life and doing something else. Where do you stand on that?
So I'm a huge fan of term limits, right? Across the board. I think part of what's wrong with our country right now is we don't have term limits. Right. We have people coming in and they spend a small amount of the time when they get in office taking care of the people's business, and then they spend the rest of the time that they're in office campaigning. It's an endless cycle. I've seen it. I've been in D.C. at the White House for 14 years now. It's just every single event has something to do with the campaign, and it just consumes so much of the taxpayers' time and money. And I think that we'd be much better served if we had term limits. So I think there should be term limits for the president, for the Senate, for the House, for everybody. And those could vary, I guess. You could say, the president would have six to 8 years term limit. Say 8 years for the president, 6 years for the Senate, and 4 years for the House, or something like that.
Well, constitutionally, the president is limited to 2 terms in office, but we don't have any constitutional limits on Congress.
That's right.
So you can just run, until you're dead. I mean, basically.
And it's a problem, and that's what a lot of people do, obviously, right? And then when they get in there, they end up eventually, representing other interests and not necessarily representing their constituents sometimes,
Yeah.
And I think, I think the problem with term limits right now, and like I said, I'm a huge fan of term limits, and I will, the good thing is running for the House, the voters get to decide every 2 years, but I just go right up front and tell you that I would not plan to stay in this job more than 8 to 10 years. I've already got a full career in the Navy right now, 25 years. Right. I would love to represent this district for the next 10 years and do a fantastic job doing it, and then turn it over to somebody else who's new, who's aggressive, who's, enthusiastic about it. The problem with term limits right now is that, if everybody doesn't abide by this, it's a big disadvantage for you, right? And I'll tell you, this is why I think I can get away, and this is why I think I'm a great candidate for this district right now. Well, there's a variety of reasons, but this is a big reason here, is term limits right now are a big disadvantage for somebody who doesn't have any type of influence going in, right? Mac Thornberry's been in Congress for 24, 26 years?
Yeah, going on 26,
26 years, right? He has incredible influence there, right? When they had the House, he was chairing committees. He's a ranking member on committees now. He's got a big voice there. When he says he wants something done, people listen to what he has to say. He can make a difference, right? He didn't get there on day one. That's based on tenure. Right. When the day that Mac Thornberry leaves this district, the day he leaves, that influence is gone. It's over. It's over for the district. And the district's going to have a freshman congressman in there, and either he or she is going to have zero influence in this district. They're going to be a freshman congressman in what looks like, I'm hoping we win the House back, it'll be a majority House, but potentially, let's just say potentially a freshman Congress in a minority House, that person is going to have zero influence. No one's going to care who that person is, what district they're from, or what problems their district has. None. I'm the exception to that. I've been in the White House with the president in his administration for the last 3.5 years. I know everyone in the West Wing. I know all the cabinet secretaries. I have their phone numbers. They answer the phone when I call. If there's issues that involve the district that need to be done at that level, I can make it happen. I have the ear of the folks in the West Wing. I know the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, the national security advisor, the domestic policy council folks. Anybody and everybody that's going to have an impact. So I am the one exception because I don't have to wait 6 to 8 years to develop the influence that's required to have a voice for the district. I can have a voice for this district on day one, and I think that's what sets me apart.
On health care, of course, Obamacare proved to be a disaster. You have a very unique perspective on this, having been a physician for many years, having worked in the medical field for all these years. You've seen the inner workings of the political and the business side of that, and how it affects patients, how it affects people, particularly in the military. You've seen how the VA works. What would be your answer to this? Where do we go with health care?
That's a difficult problem, but it's something we absolutely positively have to fix. And you're right. We can't say we're going to repeal and replace and then not have something to replace it with. I think, part of the problem has been appropriately repealing it, right? It's been more difficult than just signing a piece of paper and saying it's dead. It's been tied up in the courts, this, that, and the other. And I think recently, the individual mandate was struck down, which was huge, obviously. And I think that's that was the death sentence for Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act as we know it, right? Yeah. So I think that it's in the process of dying. Now we have to figure out what we're going to do. Now, Medicare for all, that is absolutely positively not the answer, right? That's what everybody's running on the left right now. That's insane. Even people on the left understand that that's not possible. You cannot do that. So, we have to get in there and we have to do something that's going to be affordable for everybody. And I know people in this district, it's a huge deal for them. Their insurance premiums are ridiculous, right? And I think that what's happening right now is I think that things sometimes have to get worse before they get better, and the pendulum has to swing all the way over to one direction before it starts coming back. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, we've had people on the left, though, basically come out and say it. The end game for them is single payer health care. Government run, government mandated, government managed, top to bottom, government managed health care.
That's what I'm saying. I think that's good for us right now. You know why? Because I think that they're not hiding it anymore. They're out there saying it. It's scaring the crap out of people, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that people are getting scared right now. Not only folks are getting scared, where I think we're going to change things is I think right now, I think the pharmaceutical companies, the big healthcare organizations, and the health insurance companies are starting to get scared too. They're realizing for the first time that if they don't step up to the plate and they don't come up with a solution, with the Republicans, with the conservatives that want to fix this and come up with a solution that's good for everybody. If they don't fix it, somebody's going to fix it for them. And that somebody's going to be Nancy Pelosi and Elizabeth Warren and people like that. And that scares them to death. So I think that we're in a position right now where there's some momentum to get people that have, because some of those, the pharmaceutical companies, the health insurance companies, they've profited pretty substantially over the years from this. You know what I mean? They could take less on their end, and they could make things more affordable for us. And I think that's what they're going to absolutely have to do. And we're going to have to we're going to have to work with them to do that. But I think they have an interest in doing it now.
There's going to have to be some cooperative effort between the medical care professionals, the pharmaceutical companies, the hospitals, the clinics. Everyone's going to have to work together, and that seems to have been the problem all along. No one ever wants to meet in the middle on this stuff. Everyone's got their own
it's just like everything else with the liberals. They want everybody to have some type of government entitlement, because when you have a government entitlement, then they own you to some extent.
Ronny Jackson, candidate for Republican nomination for 13th Congressional District. If people want to learn more about you, I'm assuming you have a website set up for
I do.
that.
You can go to www.ronnyjackson4texas13.com, and that's RonnyForTexas13.com, all spelled out. RonnyJackson4Texas13.com.
And of course, you've got your Twitter page, which is exploding.
Yeah.
And so people can find you on social media as well. Ronny Jackson, thanks for being with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.